Welcome to the Girl Horror Podcast, produced by Glassbone Media. My name is Alice, and I have a lot to say about cinema that crosses the intersection between girlhood and horror. In last week's episode, we explored the dark and ominous shadows that fall behind the convent walls, looking at Michael Mohan's 2024 nansploitation horror film Immaculate, starring Sydney Sweeney. In this week's episode, we're going back to high school. Cast your mind back to the early days of adolescence, when the world is scary and mean and you're doing anything you can to fit in. Today we're going to be talking about a film that many laud as the birth of girl horror. It's time to talk about Brian De Palma's 1976 film, Carrie.
It's the night of the senior prom. The Bates High School gym is alive with excitement. Everybody is there, even Carrie White. The girl no one likes.
We're all sorry about this incident, Cassie.
It's Carrie!
Based on the 1974 novel by Stephen King, De Palma's Carrie is one of the most prolifically replicated films in the girl horror scene, in story, message, and visual imagery. If you tell me you're a horror fan and you haven't seen the image of a woman's face dripping with blood in a horror film, then I can tell you that you're lying. It has been remade multiple times, but in my opinion, nothing quite beats De Palma's collaboration with Sissy Spacek to create the absolute masterpiece of cinema that is Carrie from 1976.
For Carrie, it will be a dream come true. For everyone else, it will be a nightmare. Carrie. A new film by Brian De Palma. Based on the chilling bestseller. Starring Sissy Spacek, Piper Laurie, and introducing John Travolta in his first motion picture role.
Famous as John Travolta's debut film appearance and known for its innovative use of split diopter and split-screen camera work, De Palma's Carrie is truly a foundational piece in the girl horror subgenre. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. First, let's go back in time to the mid-70s and set the scene. Brian De Palma's Carrie cannot be looked at without acknowledging the context of change that was going on in real life in 1976. With the Vietnam War ending just a year earlier, there was a heaviness around the American identity and the trauma that conflict brings. The US was navigating the aftermath of Watergate, which also led to a huge mistrust in political institutions. With Gerald Ford in office as president, the country was dealing with economic difficulties that included high inflation and unemployment rates. Naturally, popular culture of the time followed a similar shift to reflect these difficult times and allow people to cope with things they were living through. We see the disco craze sweep dance floors across the country, with the Bee Gees and Donna Summer topping the charts. Rock and roll artists like Led Zeppelin, Queen and the Eagles were also thriving, giving a voice to a generation who felt confused and angry. Among all this political uncertainty and the cultural evolution that came from it, Stephen King's novel Carrie had already made waves, and the film adaptation was highly anticipated. It emerged as a chilling and provocative force in cinema at a time when horror films were starting to transcend traditional boundaries and begin exploring psychology and social issues more deeply. The story of Carrie, a tormented high school girl with telekinetic powers, was one that resonated deeply in a society who were increasingly aware of the complexities of adolescence and bullying, but also starting to question the potential for real-life supernatural forces. With aircraft successfully landing on Mars and the Apple Incorporated setting the path for the personal computer revolution, the certainty that we're alone in the universe was slowly crumbling. Sissy Spacek's haunting portrayal of Carrie White was iconic for its time, and the climactic prom scene etched itself into the annals of horror history. As audiences took their seats and crunched their popcorn, they weren't just consuming any other film, but a horror film that truly reflected and magnified the anxieties, transitions, and eerie undercurrents of change that ran rife in the mid-1970s. Carrie is a tale that has captivated audiences for decades, with its blend of supernatural horror and deeply human themes. The 1976 film adaptation, directed by Brian De Palma, tells the story of Carrie White, played by Sissy Spacek, a shy, socially awkward high school girl who lives under the oppressive control of her fanatically religious mother, Margaret White, played by Piper Laurie. Carrie faces relentless bullying from her classmates, which only intensifies her feelings of isolation and low self-esteem. The film begins with a traumatic incident in the school locker room, where Carrie experiences her first ever period. Unaware of what's happening to her, she panics and is convinced she is dying. Her classmates mock her by throwing sanitary products at her and shouting at her to plug it up, until she is left in a dejected and terrified heap on the floor of the girls' locker room. This traumatic event triggers the awakening of Carrie's latent telekinetic powers, which will allow her to move objects with her mind. It's a power that grows stronger as she faces increasing emotional distress. Feeling remorseful for her role in the locker room incident, Sue Snell convinces her boyfriend Tommy Ross to take Carrie to the prom as an act of kindness. But another of the bullies, Chris Hargensen, plots a malicious prank to humiliate Carrie further. To her disbelief, and after fighting with her mother about it, Carrie finds herself at the prom and for the first time in her life experiencing what she thinks is a normal high school experience. She has a brief moment of happiness and acceptance, sharing a dance with Tommy and even being crowned prom queen. Wouldn't it be great if that's where the film ended? But no. As she receives her crown and finally feels she has been accepted by her peers, a bucket full of pig's blood is dropped from the ceiling where it's been rigged by Chris and the other bullies and covers her head to toe. Humiliated and enraged, Carrie unleashes her powers in a catastrophic rampage, causing death and destruction everywhere and to everyone at the school. Carrie returns home seeking comfort from her mother, but instead her fanatic Christian mother Margaret, believing Carrie is possessed by evil, attacks her. In self-defense, Carrie uses her powers to kill her mother. Overwhelmed by the events, she ultimately succumbs to her injuries and dies. The film concludes with a haunting scene suggesting the trauma and horror of Carrie's life continue to impact those who survived. Quite a tale, right? And let me tell you, describing it briefly and verbally does not do justice to the power of this story. Now, before we look deeper at the film and its very obvious links to the girl horror genre, let's take a step back and look at the source material.
They cared, they identified with her, and they cheered, basically, when she pulled down the gymnasium and the whole place caught fire.
In 1974, Carrie was Stephen King's debut novel, setting the groundwork for what would become a long and lucrative career as a horror author. The book follows the same basic plot as the film, but has far more depth and background given to us through a unique narrative structure. The book provides us with a series of documents, including newspaper articles, letters, and excerpts from books, which provide a broader context for the events. Both the film and the novel Carrie explore themes of bullying, repression, and the destructive potential of unchecked power. They offer a potential commentary on the experiences of girlhood and the impact of trauma. I'm sure you can already see why Carrie has become synonymous with the birth of the girl horror genre, and we'll be discussing that in more detail later in the episode. Now that we know what happens in the film, and have talked about the original novel by Stephen King, let's dive deeper into the context of the 1970s when it was released. As we've mentioned, the 1970s were a time of change and discomfort for many. The rise of the feminist and women's liberation movement led to an increase in the fight for gender equality and a push to further challenge stereotypical gender roles. This undoubtedly led to an increase in more nuanced portrayals of female characters in literature and film, respectively. Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the US in 1973 and helped grant women greater autonomy over their own bodies, while a push for workplace equality led to strides in equal pay and anti-discrimination, not to mention greater opportunities for women more generally. From this broader shift in perspectives on women also came a change in views on teenagers and puberty, with an increase in sex education in schools providing teens with more accurate information about their own bodies and sexual health. I can't help but think if Carrie had been taught about her period in school, then the entire prom tragedy could have been completely avoidable. Is this film just propaganda? I'm here for it. At the same time, society started to approach the psychological difficulties that teenagers face from bullying and peer pressure, as well as a difficult family life. All of these are things that Carrie White deals with, and although she has a teacher looking out for her, there is nowhere near enough intervention and far too much acceptance that girls just will be mean and being naive is completely normal for a teenage girl. We also see a shift away from religious fundamentalism in the 1970s, where the likes of Carrie's fanatic mother were becoming more frowned upon, as we see their extreme beliefs contributing to their own torment and eventual breakdown. The religious context of this film sits on a fork in the road where the evangelical community is gaining traction and promoting strict conservative values, while more progressive movements are growing as people develop greater personal freedom in other areas of life too. These two incompatible camps inevitably lead to cultural tensions, which are represented perfectly by Carrie's mother, Margaret White. Arguably as a result of these shifts in society, horror film generally was beginning to move away from the traditional monster horror to more psychological horror. Carrie fits the bill perfectly here, bridging the gap by being a psychological horror that is also a monster horror too in lots of ways. Carrie explores fear and anxiety in similar ways to the 1973 Exorcist movie, and even Halloween from 1978. The 70s were a time of change for horror cinema, and for girl horror in particular. Carrie cannot be ignored as a seminal piece. By situating Carrie within the cultural and societal context of the 1970s, we can better understand its significance as a pioneering work in the horror genre that addressed and reflected changing perceptions of girlhood and womanhood during a pivotal era of feminist activism. Second-wave feminism, built on suffrage and legal rights work, wanted to broach broader issues than its predecessors, who were focused on the right to vote, with education opportunities encouraging girls to pursue education and careers that had typically been dominated by men. Women were held with less and less expectation to be homemakers and mothers during the 1970s and beyond. We had challenges to stereotypical body image and beauty standards playing a part in the success of Sissy Spacek's Carrie portrayal, with her traditional blonde hair and slim figure allowing her to pass with her peers, but her almost ghostly stare and unique facial expressions classing her as somehow strange and different. At its core, Carrie focuses on a teenage girl grappling with puberty, bullying, and a domineering mother. All of these are themes that bring attention to the struggles and anxieties of girlhood at the time. Carrie's eventual empowerment through supernatural ability can be seen and has frequently been analysed as a metaphor for the contemporary feminist push for women's empowerment and autonomy. Although in a different way to Immaculate from our last episode, the film critiques patriarchal and religious oppression quite blatantly, especially through Carrie's mother, who represents the extreme control and repression of the church.
With her crazy mother.
Help the sinning woman see the sin of her days and ways. Show her that if she had remained sinless, the curse of blood would never have come on her.
So, we've looked at the context from which Carrie came about. Now, let's talk briefly about where the story for Carrie came from in the first place.
I knew a couple of girls who were at the very bottom of the social pecking order. You know, high school is probably the most savage social caste system that America has. You know, it's very divided and popularity becomes very important, and it's very difficult for adolescents because they're not emotionally grounded yet. And these girls were the absolute bottom. And then later, as a teacher, I saw the same thing from the other side of the desk. And those two things came together for me, along with a number of articles that I'd seen about the possibility that psychokinetic phenomena, if it existed, probably existed in teenagers and probably existed in disturbed teenage girls. And I thought this would make a terrific book, so I wrote it.
Stephen King was inspired to write Carrie in part by simply observing the society around him at the time, but also because of some personal experiences from his own life. While he makes a point to never name them, King has openly mentioned two girls from strict religious families that he knew in high school. Because of their difference in upbringing and therefore general attitudes, they were socially outcast and faced severe bullying, struggling to fit in with the others in the class. Using this as a basis for Carrie's character, King intersected the story with the rise of the women's liberation movement. This enabled him to frame Carrie's story within broader themes of women's empowerment and the struggles faced by women and girls to give us the story we have today. Wanting something more horror-esque to make the story pop better, King said he was also inspired by reading articles about telekinesis, which described the ability to move objects with your mind. This concept sparked his imagination and led him to explore what might have happened if a teenage girl with suppressed anger and trauma discovered that she had these powers and was to be pushed so far that she used them against her peers in a vengeful frenzy. Now, I've pretty much taken you through the plot of this film already, but given that it went on to become such a cornerstone of the girl horror genre, I want to look at some scenes in a bit more detail. Which parts in particular really set up Carrie as the queen of girl horror? Well, it all begins in the girls' locker room. The locker room incident is world famous now as one of the most traumatic scenes in horror. That's not because it's a horror scene, but because it's a pain that so many of us have known. It positions Carrie as someone we pity and allows us to almost understand her transformation into a monster figure because of everything she's been through at the hands of others. This opening scene where Carrie experiences her first ever period in the school locker room is pivotal to the entire plot. Not understanding what's happening to her own body puts the fear of God in her, and mixed with the cruel reaction from her classmates tragically explores the theme of fear and confusion around female puberty, potentially the most girl horror topic of all. This moment in the film is significant to girlhood by epitomizing the vulnerabilities and often traumatic experience of being a teenage girl. Carrie's overwhelming panic is one that lots of us have experienced, but hopefully met with kind words and reassurance. Carrie being subject to intense bullying as a result of her panic almost makes you think, yeah, fair enough, when she becomes that monster at the end. This psychological trauma makes sense as the starting point for the birth of her powers and, unfortunately, the start of her demise. Another iconic scene in Carrie is, of course, the shower of pig's blood during the prom night crowning ceremony. The entire film builds up to this climactic moment, which serves as a demonstration of her ultimate humiliation and betrayal just at the point where she starts to think things might be changing. Prom night is typically a rite of passage for high school girls, but instead of being a night of fun and frivolity, it turns into a true nightmare for Carrie, destroying her fleeting acceptance and joy. Teenage acceptance is fragile in nature, and high school social hierarchies are brutal enough that I don't even think Chris's prank is that far-fetched. The visual shock of the soft floral delight of the prom being ruined by blood, rage, fire, and death catapults Carrie as a blend of body horror and supernatural terror. That incredibly dizzying scene of Carrie and Tommy dancing round and round and round and round in circles is the perfect lead-up to this moment too, putting us on edge in a way that confuses excitement and fear in a very familiar fashion. So we've looked at the locker scene incident and the prom night fiasco. Now let's talk about what's happening behind the scenes for Carrie White.
He was weak.
No!
He was weak. Say it.
No,
Glenn.
Mama!
Say it.
He was weak. He was weak.
The Lord visited Eve with a curse. The curse was a curse of blood.
You should have told me, Mama. You should have told me.
Oh, Lord, help the sinning woman see the sin of her days and ways. Show her that if she had remained sinless, the curse of blood would never have come on her. She may have been tempted by the Antichrist. She may have committed the sin of lustful thoughts.
No, Mama.
Oh, don't lie.
The interactions between Carrie and her mother, Margaret, are absolutely crucial to understanding the oppressive and abusive environment in which Carrie has been raised. Margaret's extreme religious fanaticism and attempts to suppress Carrie's emerging womanhood highlight the destructive impact of trying to control a young girl's identity and self-worth. Arguably, without Margaret, none of this would have happened. The domestic horror that Carrie's torturous prayer cupboard demonstrates that her home is not a safe place, but a place of terror, fear, and repression. During her final showdown with her mother Margaret, Carrie finally cracks in her need for autonomy and freedom from her mother's oppressive control. Margaret tries to kill Carrie, believing she's purging evil in the process, but ultimately loses to her daughter's immense telekinetic power and overwhelming vengeful rage. This film is a fascinating one to play the blame game with, and I will note that most people agree that what Carrie did is not her fault, but that of those around her. Whether it's her classmates throwing tampons at her in the changing room, or her mother forcing her to repent for the sin of her first blood, Carrie is pushed from side to side throughout her adolescence in a way that makes it unsurprising that she finally snaps. Throw in some telekinesis, and it's just a recipe for disaster. So, we've discussed everything that goes on around Carrie throughout this film, and the devastating impact it has on her. But who really is Carrie White underneath it all? How is she portrayed in such a way that makes us feel sympathy for her, instead of agreeing that she really is a monster? It's no secret that Carrie is a hugely vulnerable and isolated young woman. Her social awkwardness and lack of self-confidence comes from years of mistreatment and ostracization from both inside and outside her home. She's desperate for acceptance, like most teenage girls are, and will do anything in the hope of a real connection, despite being unable to find it anywhere. You can see from the first scene of the film that underneath her shy exterior, Carrie is harbouring some deep emotional turmoil as she grapples with feelings of inadequacy, shame, and all-round fear instilled in her by her mother's religious fanaticism. This internal struggle between her desire for normalcy and the trauma she experiences in pursuit of it fuels a huge amount of the narrative tension in the story. Discovering her telekinetic powers serves as a metaphor for her latent strength and potential, which have so far been completely overlooked and suppressed. This is a huge point. Given different circumstances, Carrie could have had a happy ending. She just needed someone to give her a real chance to open up and explore her own potential, instead of pushing her until it burst from her to much darker consequence. Carrie's telekinesis serves as both a plot device and a symbolic representation of her inner strength and latent power. These powers are symbolic of her repressed potential and the untapped reservoir of strength within her. Carrie's rampage at the prom can be read as her cracking out of the shell of being a meek victim and finally standing centre stage in a powerful act of vengeance. It represents a cathartic release of pent-up rage and anger that allows her to assert agency and regain her autonomy as a person. While I would never argue that killing hundreds of people in vengeance is the right course of action, I do find it fascinating and enjoyable that despite the destruction she unleashes, Carrie remains a sympathetic character throughout the narrative. Her actions are driven by a desire for acceptance and love, something we can all understand, as well as an absolute need to break free from the cycle of abuse perpetrated by her mother and her classmates. Something that only someone very troubled would disagree is a very fair and necessary journey. As the audience, we empathise with Carrie's plight right from the start, and by the end of the film we find ourselves rooting for her despite the horrors she perpetrates. That's why this film is so satisfying in terms of girl horror. It's very bleak in lots of ways and showcases some of the common traumas that all teenage girls go through in one way or another. And to watch it happen to someone who stands up and metaphorically screams in the face of that trauma, when in real life, of course, that's not possible, feels like sisterhood and empowerment at its finest. They say we watch films to experience things in fiction that we cannot experience in real life, and I think Carrie is no exception. It's also important to note that Carrie herself is a victim even by the end. After that empowering moment of vengeful rage, she does end up succumbing to her own injuries in a way that gives us an even stronger message about what happens when trauma and abuse are left unchecked. Carrie White has emerged as a symbol of female empowerment in horror cinema. Her story highlights the struggles of teenage girls and the difficult power dynamics at play in society. Carrie's journey from victim to avenger continues to resonate with audiences as a testament to the strength and resilience of young women, rising from the girl horror ashes, as it were. Carrie is a complex and multifaceted character whose journey from victim to avenger encapsulates themes of empowerment, trauma, while critiquing societal negligence on young women. Carrie is a compelling blend of psychological depth and supernatural intrigue, and this makes her the perfect poster girl for girl horror cinema. Her story continues to resonate with audiences as a powerful exploration of the human condition, and endures as a legacy of girl horror in popular culture that remains true to the experiences of teenage girls to this day. Basically, all hail Carrie. So, we've looked at context, plot, and character. Now I want to talk about why Brian De Palma's Carrie specifically will always be my Carrie, because of directorial and production choices that culminated in this masterpiece being, well, a masterpiece.
The genius of Brian De Palma was that he fooled us into taking our armor off just before the movie was over. We unarmored in our minds. We were already thinking about where's my coat? Make sure that my wife gets her hat. Do you have money to pay the babysitter when we get home? So you're totally open and totally vulnerable to what happens. Now, at least I knew there was something. The audience had no clue.
Brian De Palma's Carrie is famous for its use of interesting visual styles and cinematic techniques. De Palma's not afraid to use a split screen and split diopter to create a sense of voyeuristic unease in the audience. These techniques allow us to see multiple perspectives at once in a way that feels abnormal and really ramps up tension and suspense. The use of the split diopter throughout the film builds us up perfectly for the famous prom night split scene that allows us to view Carrie's reaction and the destruction she is causing simultaneously. It's just beautifully done. Alongside split diopter and split screen, he employs slow motion and dream sequencing to evoke a surreal and almost hypnotic atmosphere to his story. He blurs the line between reality and fantasy in a way that I think perfectly reflects that teenage girl's state of mind. There's a gradual escalation of stakes and suspension in this film that leads up perfectly to that climactic prom scene. De Palma's careful control of pace and rhythm in narrative and cinematography keeps the audience on the edge and in anticipation of the inevitable something is about to go very wrong feeling that is so perfect for horror cinema. Not only is De Palma a master of camera work, but he also clearly has a keen eye for iconic visual motifs. Following on from that first scene of Carrie discovering herself bleeding in the shower, the film cycles through the image of blood and water as a perfect metaphor for her innocence being corrupted. I can't explain it, but it's just incredible. I could almost make a whole separate episode just discussing the image of blood and water in Carrie. Similarly, throughout the film, we see colours being used to represent feeling. Red is shown for passion, rage, danger, while lighter pastel colours represent safety and joy. Carrie's own prom dress begins a pastel pink and is turned red by the pig's blood prank, just as she begins to joyful and innocent and is turned rageful and violent. It's almost like her mother predicted it when she said her dress was red, when actually it's not. Looking at the film's music, De Palma collaborates with composer Pino Donaggio, I'm always definitely mispronouncing that, but we'll go with it, to create a haunting and evocative score that really enhances the atmosphere of tension in the film. The use of eerie soundscape and discordant melodies contributes to the overall feeling of unease and apprehension. The soundscape employs sudden shifts in sound and silence to jolt the audience and create moments that are truly shocking and come as a surprise to the viewer. These great auditory contrasts heighten the impact of key scenes that we talked about earlier. Altogether, the stylistic choices that went on behind the camera enhanced the emotional intensity and vulnerability of Carrie's character, allowing us as the audience to empathise with her plight and experiencing her inner turmoil firsthand. It's like we're up there on that stage with her in many ways. De Palma's masterful manipulation of cinematic techniques keeps us in a constant state of nervous anticipation by carefully controlling pace, visual, sound design. This maximizes the impact of the horror elements and makes sure that each moment lands with maximum impact on our screens and in our hearts. Brian De Palma's directorial choices in Carrie hugely contribute to the film's status as a classic of the horror genre. I genuinely just can't understand why anyone would choose the remake over the original. When the original is just so perfect, why and how could you possibly not prefer it? If you've seen the remakes, especially the newest one, then you'll see why. It's not a bad film, but it's also not a great film either. This is as good a time as any to dig into the impact and legacy of Carrie, including its critical reception and the hugely prolific number of films that have been inspired by it since. Carrie received both critical acclaim and commercial success after its release in 1976. It was marked as a significant film in horror and agreed to be a foundational piece in the girl horror genre. At box office, Carrie earned over $30 million in the US on a modest budget of under $2 million. Audiences were clearly drawn to the blend of supernatural horror and teen angst, just as much as we are today. Carrie was known to spread like wildfire through word of mouth, as people would come out of their screenings aghast at the controversy of what they had seen, and immediately encouraging others to go and watch it so they could talk about these controversies together. Critically, Brian De Palma was praised for his innovative direction and use of cinematic styles like split screen and slow motion, also being applauded for bringing Stephen King's novel to life with psychological depth but also visual flair. Sissy Spacek received both an Academy Award for Best Actress and a Golden Globe nomination for her performance as Carrie White, with people celebrating her ability to convey Carrie's vulnerability, innocence, and also her eventual descent. Similarly, Piper Laurie, who played Carrie's mother, also received a nomination for Best Supporting Actress and a Golden Globe nomination too. She was praised for her intense and menacing show of religious fanaticism and arguably being the real villain in the film. Right from the get-go, the prom scene was highlighted for its utterly shocking impact and also its technical execution. It immediately took its rightful place in horror film history. A place that truly changed the course of horror film as we know it, and led to the creation of hundreds of girl horror classics that came after it that we'll talk about now.
To the other kids at St. Bernard Academy, they were the girls who didn't belong. 4 girls are about to discover the dark side.
You ever heard of invoking the spirit? Black magic.
So how has Carrie really influenced horror and the portrayal of female characters in girl horror since its release? There are a number of iconic things that Carrie gave the horror genre, which can be seen in so many examples since. First and most obviously, Carrie is the empowering female protagonist.
Jennifer's evil.
I know.
No, I mean, she's actually evil, not high school evil.
Carrie is one of the first to centre the narrative around a young female protagonist who discovers her power despite her vulnerability and the oppression she faces. She really paved the way for horrors that explore female empowerment through supernatural means, and specifically the traumatised teenage girl turning to the supernatural, by choice or not, to process. I'm thinking of The Craft from 1996, Jennifer's Body from 2009, and of course the incredible Ginger Snaps from 2000, which mirrors Carrie in that its central character finds herself transforming into a werewolf after her first period.
So, Fitz, I think we should get together.
No. Out by 16 or dead in the scene, but together forever.
United against life as we know it.
It sounds ridiculous, and it kind of is, but it is also absolutely iconic. If you haven't seen it already, then please do. There's likely to be a whole episode about ginger snaps later in this series. Not only does Carrie bring us the empowered woman trope, but also an exploration of the horror that comes with being a teenage girl. The film delves into the turbulent period of female adolescence, tackling puberty and bullying as well as the struggle for acceptance. Carrie brings us a stark look at the unique horrors and anxieties of girlhood in a way that was never really done before.
I used to daydream about being old enough to go on dates. I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy, driving along some pretty road. It was never about going anywhere, really. Just having some sort of freedom, I guess.
There are hundreds of films that do this now, but some of the best include It Follows from 2014 and Raw from 2016. Both of these use horror as a metaphor for the fears and challenges of growing up as a woman in a way that makes them an inevitable homage to Carrie. Carrie invites us to address the intersection between horror and social issues too, using horror to critique and reflect on societal difficulties like religious fanaticism, the consequences of bullying, and even the stigma around menstruation. Equally, Carrie looks at the sympathetic monster and complex villain trope, which many horror films since have capitalised on. Let the Right One In from 2008 and Black Swan from 2010 both feature female characters who really blur the line between victim and villain in an effort to invoke a terrifying empathy in the audience. These are so obviously inspired by Carrie.
Please believe me. Sweet girl. Sweet girl. What happened to my sweet girl? She's gone!
Of course, we couldn't talk about legacy and impact without discussing the blood-drenched scene that left such a lasting visual image in the minds of audiences and continues to this day to influence horror cinema. That image is potentially the image of girl horror, if I had to choose one. This blood drench is seen throughout all kinds of horror subgenres, but some that come to mind are The Descent from 2005, The Neon Demon from 2016, and even the blood-drenched Lift from Evil Dead Rises in 2023. Carrie truly helped invite women into horror, and the film release led to the cultivation of a dedicated audience of women enjoying a genre that had arguably excluded them historically. By addressing issues directly relevant to women and girls, Carrie encouraged the production of more horrors that centre the experiences and perspectives of women, and that is a key reason why Carrie is lauded by many as the birth of the girl horror genre. Since Carrie, we've seen so many great horrors from great women. A Girl Walks Home at Night in 2014 comes to mind, as well as the incredible St. Maud in 2019 by Rose Glass. You can hear more about St. Maud in our last episode about nunsploitation horror if it interests you. There is an ever-growing influence of female voices in the horror genre, and this trend, I would argue, owes much of its groundwork to Carrie. I hope by now I've persuaded you why Carrie is such a seminal text for the girl horror subgenre. The film has been instrumental in shaping girl horror through its focus on the teen girl experience, the centering of women's empowerment alongside the critique of society's treatment of young women. Its legacy is evident in the thematic depth, complex characters, and socially relevant narratives of contemporary girl horror films that have come since. So here we are. We finally reached the end of this deep dive into the 1976 Carrie and the birth of the girl horror genre. We've discussed the context of radical change and unrest in which the film was released, as well as going through the plot and key characters in detail to demonstrate how the film paints the perfect girl horror story. We've looked at the directorial choices of Brian De Palma and his team, as well as looking at the reception to the film on its release. We've looked at the key girl horror themes and tropes that Carrie was the forebearer for, and recommended some other films to dive into if you're desperate for more. I hope I've managed to persuade you why Carrie is so important to girl horror cinema, and why the doe-eyed, blonde-haired teenager has become a true icon for the experiences of women. I would love to hear what you have to say about Carrie, so let's talk about it. Please feel free to message me your thoughts on our Instagram page @girlhorror. I should note it's Girl Horror with a U on Instagram because the I was already taken. Or comment on the YouTube video for this episode and we can start a conversation about it. As always, some of these topics can be very personal, so if you're talking about them to others, please be sensitive to the experience and opinions that they might hold. In the meantime, thanks so much for listening this far and joining me on this extensive dive into the world of Carrie White. On our next episode, we'll be going from the slow dance of prom night to the jarring and physically exhausting extreme of dance horrors Black Mirror and Suspiria.
Where'd you get these?
It's nothing.
You sweet girl.
Feel my touch. Respond to it.
Is someone's hot for teacher?
I don't want to talk about that.
We really need to relax.
It's the role, isn't it? It's all this pressure. I knew it'd be too much. I knew it.
What's she doing here? He made me your alternate.
The only person standing in your way is you.
Physical pain is so crucial to girl horror, but its juxtaposition with the joy of music and movement itself is a perfect mirror for the dichotomy of life as a woman. We've talked a lot about bodily autonomy, and dance horrors are the perfect vehicle to explore the empowerment and turmoil that comes with owning your own body and pushing it to the extreme in competition to your sisters and in pursuit of stardom and success. I'm so excited to dive in next time. So excited. Please do subscribe to the podcast so you can find future episodes more easily. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred streaming platform. Episodes are released every other Wednesday, with the potential for bonus episodes and new release reaction videos in between. I'll see you next time when we'll be discussing Black Swan and Suspiria, the physical power of girlhood in dance horror. Until then, stay girly, stay horrifying.